This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Tyler Cozzens, Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, begins today's show. He discusses the market outlook, beef exports and imports, and cattle imports. Joe Gerken, K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist, continues the show as he explains what aquatic life does during the cold months. He also reminds livestock producers about their need to make sure their animals can get water. Ending today's show is the Beef Cattle Institute's Brad White, Bob Larson, Brian Lubbers, and special guest Todd Gunderson as they converse about the difference between biocontainment and biosecurity. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. Tyler, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Tyler, beginning our conversation with a market outlook.
Sure. Yeah, so kind of looking at the market outlook here, so looking specifically at that Dodge City, Kansas report. So last week in that Thanksgiving week, we actually didn't have a report, so some of my discussion here will be comparisons to actually 2 weeks ago. But on the feeder steer price side of things, those 5 to 6 weights were actually up a good bit there, about $41, and actually ended the week at about $341, $342, compared to about $3 2 weeks ago. 6 to 7 weights were actually $278. That's actually down about $2 from 2 weeks ago. 7 to 8 weights were $262, $263. That's actually down less than $1 from 2 weeks ago. 8 to 9 weights were $255. That's actually down about $8 from a couple weeks ago. 900 to 1,000 pounds was about $248. That's actually up about $5, almost $6 from 2 weeks ago. On the feeder heifer side of things, 5 to 6 weights were actually down about $12 to $285. 6 to 7 weights were $258 to about $259. That's down about $6 from 2 weeks ago. 7 to 8 weights were actually up more than $20 to $246. 8 to 9 weights were $231. That's actually up about $3, almost $4. And then 900 to 1,000 pounds were $225. Now on the fed cattle side of things, looking at the 5-area average on a live basis, steers and heifers this last week were actually about $190. That's actually up $3, almost $4 from the prior week. But actually compared to a year ago, steer and heifer prices are actually up $15, almost $16 compared to a year ago. Now, on a dressed basis side of things, steers and heifers, steers were actually about $296 to almost $297. That's actually up about $5 from a week ago. Compared to a year ago, that's actually up about $22. Heifers were about $294, almost $295. That's up almost $5 from the prior week. That's about a $20 increase from a year ago. Now, looking on the box beef side of things, choice box beef price for last week averaged about $310. That's about in line with what we saw a week ago. Specifically, kind of looking at some of those primal values, the round, short plate, and flank posted declines from a week ago, about 1% to 2%. But those were largely offset by higher values for the chuck, the loin, and the brisket. So definitely seeing some a steady value there for the cutout value, and definitely up from a year ago. So seeing some strong prices as far as value goes for just the overall beef cuts.
Tyler, as we continue our conversation, also wanting to mention what's happening with beef exports.
Sure, yeah. So we actually just had that report come out here. So a very timely report, kind of gives us that indication of just overall demand for beef from an international standpoint. So looking at beef exports, in October, those actually totaled 241 million pounds. That's an increase of about 1% from the prior month, but it's on par with what we saw as far as export levels a year ago for that month. But I think a little bit more importantly here, looking at beef exports through the first 10 months of the year. So cumulatively, beef exports through those first 10 months have been about 2.5 billion pounds, which is actually down almost 3% from the same period in 2023. So these lower beef exports, they're actually due to lower available exportable beef supplies, which is due largely to a decline in production of about 1% year to date. And as I had mentioned just a little bit ago, part of that slowing of beef exports is also due to just higher choice box beef prices. all just kind of being a headwind to those beef exports so far this year. Now, kind of looking a little bit more closer at just the overall beef exports from our top 5 export destinations. Starting off with our top destination of Japan. Year to date through October, beef exports to Japan are about even with the same period last year at 543 million pounds shipped. Coming in next is South Korea. Exports to South Korea are actually about 9% below a year ago through the first 10 months of the year to 511 million pounds exported. Coming in at number 3 is China. Exports to China are actually down about 8% year to date through October, totaling about 394 million pounds. Mexico, number 4 destination for beef exports, actually out of the top 5 destinations. Mexico is the only destination so far that is posting a year-to-date increase, which is actually up 10% through October to 284 million pounds. This increase has largely been due to a variable to just exchange rate issues there, and so largely the exchange rate has been in the favor for product to flow southward to Mexico there. But there's been some signs that the peso this might change some of those dynamics there here. But we'll see how that plays out. On kind of rounding out those top 5 is Canada. Year to date through October, exports to Canada are actually 212 million pounds. That's actually a decline of about 7% from the same period last year. So overall, beef exports from January through October are holding strong despite the headwind of higher beef prices and strength in the dollar. But looking into 2025, exports are likely to continue to move lower, largely due to lower beef production, resulting in lower exportable beef supplies. Currently, USDA is forecasting beef exports in 2025 to be down about 8 to 9%.
And on the other side of exports, imports, and what are we seeing there, Tyler?
Sure. So on the beef import side of things, kind of an interesting discussion there. Levels continue to track higher with October at 414 million pounds imported. That's actually up 8% from September and 35% above October of 2023. Total beef imports through the first 10 months of the year are up 23% to more than 3.8 billion pounds. With the exception of Mexico, beef imports are higher for most of those suppliers that we get those beef imports from. So kind of looking through some of those major suppliers of beef imports, Australia leads that as the top supplier of beef imports to the U.S. So through the first 10 months of the year, beef imports from Australia are up almost 70% to 870 million pounds. Canada's that next top supplier, and actually through the year, imports from Canada are up 52% through October, totaling 836 million pounds. We've actually seen a larger number of beef imports from Brazil. We've seen this kind of occurring over the last few years here, and they've actually come in at the number 3 supplier so far through October, with imports up 52% to 600 million pounds. And as I mentioned, beef imports from Mexico are actually down 11% to 495 million pounds. This is due partly to the exchange rate discussion that I mentioned earlier. Now, New Zealand, imports from New Zealand are actually up 6% year to date through October to nearly 500 million pounds. But I also wanted to mention just a couple other countries, Uruguay and Argentina. Specifically, we've seen some higher levels from those countries as well, too. Beef imports are actually up 65% from Uruguay to 243 million pounds through 10 months of the year, and actually 26% increase from Argentina to 79 million pounds. So with this lower beef production forecast in 2025, beef imports are likely to remain elevated into next year. USDA is currently forecasting beef production in 2025 to be down about 2 to 3%. With beef imports for 2025 forecast to be up just under 1% from a year ago. Quick note on just USDA forecasts. So the next World Agricultural Supply and Demand estimates will actually be released next week on Tuesday, December 10th. So we'll get an update to some of those forecast numbers there from just overall beef production and beef imports and exports.
Tyler, you've mentioned beef exports, beef imports, and now going to mention cattle imports, and something that really could be playing a big factor.
Sure, yeah. So not too long ago, there was a news release from USDA APHIS, Vet Services, about the detection of New World screwworm in a Mexican cattle in the state of Chiapas. So this is kind of one of those items that's been in the news here lately, largely from a standpoint that USDA has actually banned the imports of livestock from Mexico until they get further information and protocols in place for the livestock sector importing from Mexico there. So this starts to impact just overall cattle imports from Mexico. So we'll see how this plays out, but a lot of this detection here in Mexico is tricky because there's a lag in the data and so the availability. So see how this is going to impact some of the overall supplies. Will take some time here, but I think we'll probably start to know a little bit more information as we get into the new year of 2025. Regardless, cattle imports in October were just over 201,000 head. That's actually an increase of 30% from the prior month, but actually down about 2% from a year ago. So cumulatively looking at cattle imports through 10 months of the year, cattle imports are actually up 15% to 1.8 million head. Looking at Canada, cattle imports from Canada are actually up 11% year to date, totaling 665,000 head. And looking at cattle imports year to date through October from Mexico, they're actually up 17% to more than just over 1.1 million head. So that 1.1 million head will probably see a little bit of an increase in that just from the few cattle I got through in November. But by and large, we probably won't see too many more cattle come in from Mexico through the remainder of this year. So watching that one kind of play out here. But obviously, on the USDA is working with Mexico on this new world screwworm detection. But cattle imports from Mexico will likely be one of those factors to watch in 2025, as this could impact available supplies as we go into next year.
Tyler, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That was Director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center, Tyler Cozzens. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about cold water with K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. Joe, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Joe, when we're talking about cold water, first wanting to mention how the density of water is important.
Yeah, this is a really cool idea where, most things in nature, or most things, I guess, in the environment, when they get colder and freeze, they tend to get more dense. And so think about a metal, right? As metal gets colder, it becomes hard, and that's why it's hard all the time. Water has this unique characteristic where it gets more dense until about 39 degrees Fahrenheit, and then it starts to get less dense. And so around 32 degrees Fahrenheit is where it's least dense, and that's when it's turning solid or turning into ice. And that's really important because that lower density allows ice to float. And so we'll see ice on top of the water. We all know that if we put ice in our Pepsi, it floats to the top, right? And so ice floating is really important, though, because if ice didn't float, it would sink down to the bottom and it would basically smush any critters that are living in that water body. So its ability to be less dense and float to the top is really important.
How does aquatic life adapt to that?
So that means that the most dense water is going to be warmer water, right? So it's going to be closer to that 39 degrees. And when we see that in the winter times, we're going to see things like animals are going to want to be in that deeper water. So fish are going to tend to be deeper. In summer months, the fish tend to be up near the surface because there's more oxygen. In the winter months, colder water holds more oxygen, so that doesn't matter where they're at for oxygen, but because it's warmer, we're going to tend to find them deeper. Animals like salamanders or turtles are going to tend to go down to the benthos or the bottom of the pond or stream and kind of hang out in that deeper water column too. So they're going to tend to find areas in deeper habitats where they can kind of thrive.
Is there a point where they wouldn't be able to get deep enough and possibly freeze?
Yeah, so we could see that. And, one of the things that's beneficial is that ice floats. But if our entire pond freezes, then you will see those critters freeze. There are some really cool adaptations in fish. There's a group called notothenioids that live down in Antarctica, and they are a really cool group of fish. The salt water down there can actually get sub-freezing. And so if we took a regular fish out of our Kansas pond and put it in the water down there, they would literally turn hard. They would freeze. But these fish have antifreeze proteins in their blood. And so that allows their bodies to basically keep ice from forming, even though their body temperature is below freezing. Really cool adaptations. And Kansas fish don't have those, but I just thought it was a cool little fact. So Kansas fish are going to tend to try to find warmer refuges, so those deeper habitats where they can escape the ice. But if everything freezes, the fish will freeze too.
Is there a possibility for any fishing this time of year?
Yeah, this time of year is actually a really fun time to fish. And so we've talked a little bit about different fishing opportunities in the past, but it's a good reminder that, hey, you can get out there and you can fish. Ice fishing is right around the corner. Remember, the fish are cold-blooded, so they're going to be slowing down. You're going to need a little bit slower retrieve. You generally want to use a smaller lure. They're not looking to eat a lot. A lot of times they're just biting the lure as kind of a reaction, right? They'll want to eat a little bit, but more it's just, hey, that thing's annoying me, so I'm going to bite it. So smaller lures, slower presentations tend to work really well if you're out ice fishing. Make sure that the water is safe, though, right? And so we want to make sure that we have 4 inches of water. Using a spud bar, you can hit that ice and make sure that it's safe for you to walk on. So that safety aspect is really important. Another really good opportunity this time of year is trout fishing. And so Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks stocks a bunch of rainbow trout throughout the state at different lakes. And so you can go out to these lakes and do some trout fishing. So catch some of these trout. It's a unique opportunity in Kansas. You do need to have a valid fishing license, and you do need to buy a trout stamp. So that would be an addition. But really cool opportunity to be able to go out and catch a fish that we wouldn't see most of the time of the year in our area.
Does any of the aquatic life almost go into like a hibernation?
Yeah, so when things are slowing down, reptiles and amphibians specifically go into a state called brumation. And brumation is very similar to hibernation in mammals. And so the animal's still alive, it's still functioning, but we see things like the amount of oxygen that these animals are using decreases to almost nothing. So their breathing really, really slows down. You can actually see these animals, like ice can start to form over surfaces of their bodies. Some animals have adaptations to kind of thrive or survive in that. But they're kind of hanging out. Turtles and different amphibians, reptiles and amphibians, tend to like hide underneath leaf litter or mud and kind of bury themselves a little bit and just hang out there and kind of do nothing. They're not going to eat. They're not going to defecate. They're just going to kind of hang out for a few months while that water is really cold.
How do they continue to breathe?
So that's a really cool adaptation. So turtles specifically have an adaptation called cloacal breathing, and the cloaca is where waste is emitted through reptiles. And so they can actually go put their tails up in the air where their cloaca is, and they can breathe through their cloaca. So normally that's where waste is coming out, but they have this adaptation where they can breathe through that cloaca. Kind of a neat little cool adaptation.
Joe, how do they come out of that cooler weather and brumation?
Brumation ends, it's a lot like hibernation. So we start to get some spring days, some warmer temperatures, longer days, so more daylight that's kind of going on throughout the day. And that triggers these animals to kind of wake up and come out of this situation. So the warmer water, the more light, triggers that spring activity. The animals are then going to start to feed. So they've used up a lot of their fat reserves while they're in that brumation state. So they're going to be excited about feeding, try to put on a lot of weight, and then they're going to jump right into breeding season. So they kind of come out of it just like we'd think. They wake up from hibernation based on those warmer temperatures and more daylight, and then kind of go back to their regular activity.
Can they ever come out of brumation too early?
Yeah, so we can see that too, and it's they don't really come out of it too early, but if we have like a warm day in January or February or something like that, you might see them climb up on a log and try to warm up a little bit. And then as soon as those temperatures start to drop again, they kind of say, hey, I don't want to be around this, and go back to their little hiding spot and re-enter that dormancy stage. So it's not like it's you either are in it or out of it. You can kind of peek in and out of it from time to time. They're still alive. They're still moving. I think that's something with hibernation that we don't realize a lot of times, that when animals are hibernating, they're sometimes getting up and moving from one side of where they're hanging out their den to another. It's the analogy that we like to use is like a sleeping dog, right? So if your dog's asleep, it's mostly sleeping, but it might rearrange how it's sleeping. It might move from one side of the couch to another. They're kind of moving around a little bit, just not very much.
And when we're thinking about ponds and ice and water, important to remember our livestock as well.
Yeah, so that aspect of ice floating is really important for allowing wildlife to thrive, right? So if ice were to sink, it would crush the critters like I talked about. So it's really important that it floats. But because that ice is floating, that does create some more work or maintenance required for livestock producers. So cattle require water in colder months, just like they do throughout the year. And those requirements are somewhere around 5 or 10 gallons a day for beef cattle. Small ruminants, it's probably 2 to 5 gallons a day. So when it gets really cold, we tend to think about forage and making sure that our livestock have enough food, but having access to that water is really important too. And so things like cutting ice is a easy area to start if you need to go out and make sure that there is access to the liquid water for your cattle. You can also prepare ahead of time, and so doing things like putting heaters into troughs or using larger troughs that can hold more water and take longer to get to that freezing temperature. Really long-term proactive planning would be running some like geothermal tubing through a dam, for example, so that the water can come out of a pond, run through the earth and warm itself up, and that allows it to kind of trickle through and stay liquid throughout the year. So lots of good opportunities there and things to be thinking about. Right now we need to be reactive and kind of make sure that we have water accessible. But as we get through the colder months, it's something to make sure we have a management plan for, to kind of make sure, hey, how can we make sure that next winter our cattle can have, or our livestock can have, access to water throughout those cold months?
If people want to find out more information about aquatic life during the winter or any time, where can they do that?
Yeah, reaching out to your local extension agent is a great place to start, so I would definitely recommend that. The Kansas State Research and Extension Wildlife Management page has some really cool videos that have been coming out, a lot of good information. Our social media has a lot of infographics. Our people have been doing really good stuff there, so lots of great resources to reach out to.
Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State Fisheries and Aquatics Extension Specialist Joe Gerken. If you'd like to learn more about wildlife, one way you can do that is by checking out K-State Extension's Wildlife Management website. You can find that website by going to www.wildlife.k-state.edu. Again, that is www.wildlife.k-state.edu. On that page, you can find information about wildlife species, learn more information about their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast, and check out videos on their YouTube channel. I will link these resources in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and ending today's show is Brad White, Bob Larson, Brian Lubbers, and Todd Gunderson.
There's a couple words that sometimes get thrown around: biocontainment and biosecurity. As we differentiate those, what I really care about is when I bring new animals onto my operation, what are the things I should be thinking about? And Bob, I may ask you to define biosecurity and biocontainment for us before we jump into what I should do.
So when we think about biosecurity, think about those types of diseases that I could keep out of my herd. So they're not likely to already be in my herd, and we have the tools to keep them out. Biocontainment, that's really for the more common diseases that are circulating in a lot of cattle populations. And so I'm not really going to keep it out of the herd, but what I'm trying to do is to prevent, higher loads of that pathogen at times or to animals that are most susceptible. So I'm not trying to get rid of it. I'm just trying to minimize the losses. So biocontainment, minimize losses. Biosecurity, actually trying to keep a pathogen out.
Todd, I'm going to turn to you. And as you worked with your clients in practice, I've got a commercial cow-calf herd. I'm going to be bringing on maybe some heifers, maybe some bulls once in a while. Give me some baseline recommendations or things I should be thinking about when I'm going to do that.
Well, the number one pathogen that I always talk to my clients about as far as keeping that out of their herd was BVD. And a lot of the reason for that was because we have very good tests for identifying animals that are persistently infected with BVD, and those are the animals that tend to cause the greatest amount of harm. Another pathogen that was also very much at the forefront of my mind, and we had a lot of conversations about this, was trichomoniasis. Trichomoniasis is another pathogen that is definitely one you want to keep out of your herd. It's a venereal disease, causes a lot of problems with reproductive inefficiency, and it is actually fairly straightforward as far as keeping it out of our herd. Sometimes it can come in without us necessarily bringing it in on purpose. You know, bulls love to jump fences, and sometimes we can't do anything about that, but we can certainly keep a close eye out for the signs of trichomoniasis, and definitely there's no reason why we should ever purposefully bring that into our herd.
In both of those cases, bovine viral diarrhea virus and trichomoniasis, there's a virus and a protozoa which both have long-term carrier states, so they have animals that once they're infected, they can carry that for a long time. Brian, what about things that maybe have transient states, and we think about some of our other viruses or diseases where animals may be sick for a relatively short period of time, but could be contagious?
You have to know what you're keeping out, right? There is no one size fits all biosecurity program. So you asked about things that could be transiently infected, so stick with the reproductive theme. So IBR is a good example of a virus where animals can be transiently infected. They can also be carriers, but not probably detectable carrier states. And so if you're doing just a random diagnostic test on an animal to try to determine if it has infectious bovine rhinotracheitis or IBR virus, there's a good chance you're not going to detect it.
One of the things that we sometimes talk about, Bob, is quarantine, or keeping the new animals separate from the base herd. What do you think there? Is that a good idea? Is that something I should do every time, or only when I suspect something is wrong?
No, I think that's something you should do every time. It's not foolproof, and I'll tell you a couple of caveats, but what we're really interested in, a lot of times as you move animals, you're moving environment, they've gone through transit and those types of things. That's a time frame when they might break with disease. And so I don't really want an animal that's getting sick just immediately put in with my base cow herd. But on the other side, I also want to protect the new cattle from any diseases that may be circulating in the base cow herd. So a good recommendation is to keep any new entries into the herd separated from the rest of the herd for 30 days or so. Let your veterinarian kind of give you the details. But those need to be disease-free days. So if you have kind of an outbreak either in your base herd or the new animals coming in, you need to extend that. Now, the reason that's not 100% is there's some diseases that have these long-term carrier states that don't appear sick at the time. And so it's not perfect at eliminating those diseases, in which case, like for the two that Dr. Gunderson mentioned, trichomoniasis and BVD, you add to that quarantine period a test because we have a pretty accurate test for those two diseases. So a lot of times when we talk about quarantine, we're also talking about some testing we might do during that time frame.
That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.